Before industrial refrigeration, long-distance urban food supply chains depended entirely on sodium chloride. Salt was not a luxury seasoning or a culinary flourish. It was the foundational utility of pre-modern food security. Without it, meat spoiled within days, fish rotted in transit, and medieval cities faced starvation during harsh winter months. Because salt was biologically and economically irreplaceable, whoever controlled its supply held an absolute stranglehold over urban survival. Across the Mediterranean and Western Europe, this physical necessity was transformed into one of the most lucrative, heavily regulated, and strictly enforced monopolies in human history. States did not view salt as mere food. They viewed it as a financial engine. By restricting production, dictating shipping routes, and establishing statutory purchase quotas, merchant republics and feudal crowns extracted immense revenues from a compound found naturally across the globe. To understand how this system worked, one must discard the idea of salt as an everyday commodity and examine it as an operating business. The story of medieval salt is a study in capital allocation, monopsony power, information control, and the relentless enforcement of artificial scarcity. In the medieval economy, protein was abundant at the periphery but scarce at the center. Coastal fisheries yielded massive catches of herring and cod, while rural pastures produced surpluses of pork, beef, and cheese. Bringing these perishable assets to distant urban markets required chemical stabilization. Sodium chloride inhibits bacterial growth by drawing moisture out of organic tissue through osmosis. In an era without electricity, salt was the cold chain. This biological dependency created an economic reality that every medieval ruler understood. The price elasticity of demand for salt was virtually zero. Consumers could reduce their consumption of wine, timber, or fine textiles during hard times, but they could not stop consuming salt. Human biology demanded a minimum daily intake, and agricultural preservation demanded tons of it every season. Production, however, was bound by harsh geographic and climatic constraints. In the sun-drenched coastal marshes of the Mediterranean, salt was harvested through solar evaporation. Seawater was channeled into expansive, shallow clay basins, where sun and wind evaporated the moisture, leaving behind crystallized salt crusts. This method required enormous initial capital expenditures to construct dikes, sluice gates, and gradient canals. Once built, the marginal cost per ton was remarkably low because the energy input, solar radiation, was entirely free. Further north, under cloudier skies, salt had to be produced by boiling seawater or saline groundwater in large lead or iron pans over timber fires. While these salterns required lower initial capital outlays, their operational expenses were astronomical. A single boiling facility could strip hundreds of acres of forest every year to sustain its furnaces. As regional timber supplies vanished, fuel costs soared, rendering northern boiling salterns structurally vulnerable to competition from cheap southern solar salt. This geographic divergence set the stage for a massive commercial opportunity. If a state could secure low-cost solar production at the source and control the maritime logistics networks carrying it inland, it could capture a perpetual revenue stream from landlocked populations. The Republic of Venice provided the definitive blueprint for transforming a natural commodity into an unassailable financial monopoly. In its early history, Venice produced salt directly in the local lagoons of Chioggia. But as urban populations expanded across northern Italy during the 13th century, domestic pan capacity proved insufficient. The Venetian state faced a strategic choice: allow private merchants to import salt freely from competing Mediterranean producers, or step in and seize control of the entire supply chain. Venice chose total intervention. Through a specialized state agency known as the Collegio del Sal, or Salt Office, the Republic positioned itself as the sole legal buyer of salt across the entire Adriatic region. Rather than relying solely on state-owned production, Venice leveraged its naval dominance to establish a monopsony. Private salt producers in Ibiza, Apulia, Crete, and the island of Pag had virtually no alternative buyers with the shipping capacity to move bulk commodities. Venice used this leverage to depress acquisition prices at the source. Once raw salt was purchased, the state contracted private Venetian ship owners to transport the cargo back to the central lagoon. To ensure that merchant captains actually carried salt instead of more lucrative goods like silk or spices, the Collegio del Sal instituted a system of direct freight subsidies known as ordinaria. The state paid ship owners a guaranteed cash fee per ton of salt delivered to Venetian granaries. This subsidy was often higher than the raw value of the salt itself at the production site. For Venetian merchants, salt functioned as a subsidized ballast, guaranteeing that return voyages from the eastern Mediterranean were profitable regardless of market conditions. Upon arrival in Venice, every grain of salt was forcibly unloaded at massive fortified stone warehouses known as the Magazzini del Sale. Private sales were strictly illegal. The state held total physical custody of the supply, storing it in dry, stone-vaulted structures designed to minimize moisture loss and theft. From these central warehouses, Venice dictated terms to the landlocked cities of northern Italy. Through diplomatic pressure, military threats, and economic treaties, Venice forced neighboring territories like Bologna, Ferrara, and Verona to purchase fixed annual quotas of salt exclusively from the Republic at locked, highly inflated wholesale prices. Under these treaties, if an inland city experienced a population decline or an economic downturn and failed to consume its full quota, it was still legally obligated to pay the Venetian treasury for the uncollected volume. While Venice built its monopoly on maritime logistics and trade monopsonies, the French crown weaponized salt through direct internal taxation. Known as the Gabelle, this system evolved into one of the most sophisticated and hated tax farming mechanisms in European history. The French state did not administer salt sales directly through a civil service. Instead, the crown auctioned the exclusive rights of salt distribution and tax collection to private consortiums of wealthy investors known as tax farmers, or fermiers généraux. In exchange for these monopoly rights, the tax syndicate advanced massive, upfront cash loans directly to the royal treasury, effectively securitizing future tax revenues to fund state expenditures and military campaigns. To ensure that these private tax cartels recouped their investment with high returns, the state divided the kingdom into distinct administrative zones and enforced statutory purchase quotas. Under the law of sel de devoir, or salt of duty, every household was legally required to purchase a minimum weekly quantity of salt from state-controlled granaries, or graniers à sel, for every member of the household over 8 years of age. This salt could not be used for industrial curing or livestock. It was strictly designated for direct household consumption. If a family wished to preserve a slaughtered pig, they were required by law to make an additional purchase at a different, higher tax rate. The Gabelle created extreme regional price disparities. Coastal regions that produced salt, such as Brittany, were historically exempt or taxed at minimal rates. Meanwhile, inland provinces designated as the Pays de Grande Gabelle faced tax markups that inflated the retail price of salt by more than 30 times its extraction cost. This massive artificial price gap created a powerful incentive for black market arbitrage. A traveler carrying a single sack of salt across an administrative border could realize a life-changing profit. The result was the explosive growth of an underground economy operated by salt smugglers, known as faux sauniers. To defend the tax cartel's profit margins, the French state constructed a massive, militarized customs apparatus. Specialized paramilitary border guards, known as Gabellists, patrolled regional boundaries, searched private homes, inspected merchant wagons, and audited household tax receipts. The legal penalties for salt smuggling were severe, ranging from public flogging and heavy fines to forced labor as galley slaves or execution by hanging. Maintaining this artificial market required extraordinary coercive power. The state was forced to expend an ever-increasing portion of its tax revenues simply to police its own population and protect the cartel's monopoly pricing power. Building and maintaining a commodity monopoly appears highly lucrative on paper, but in practice, it carried immense operational friction and hidden overhead costs. Salt is an unforgiving asset to store and transport. By its chemical nature, sodium chloride is hygroscopic. It readily absorbs moisture from humid air. In unheated, poorly constructed warehouses, stored salt absorbs ambient humidity, dissolves into brine, and seeps into stone floors. Over a single winter, a warehouse could lose a significant percentage of its physical inventory to simple atmospheric decay. To prevent this, states were forced to invest heavily in specialized architecture, featuring thick walls, elevated timber floorboards, and complex ventilation systems. Beyond physical degradation, the system was vulnerable to geopolitical and climatic shocks. Solar evaporation pans depended entirely on stable summer weather patterns. A sudden season of heavy rain, unseasonable cloud cover, or localized coastal flooding could dissolve the crystal crust of the pans, destroying an entire year's harvest in a matter of days. When production collapsed at key extraction sites, merchant states faced acute supply shortages. Because inland buyers were bound to fixed purchase quotas, a failure in supply threatened not only state revenues, but also the basic food security of dependent regions. Venice was frequently forced to draw down emergency reserves or dispatch armed convoys to purchase salt from distant, non-traditional suppliers at exorbitant spot market prices. Naval warfare presented an even greater systemic threat. Because salt was a high-volume, bulk commodity, it relied on maritime shipping lanes. A naval blockade by a rival power could instantly sever the supply pipeline. During times of war, merchant ships were routinely requisitioned for military duty, disrupting the flow of subsidized return cargoes and leaving coastal warehouses empty. Furthermore, the administrative overhead required to audit merchant manifests, monitor warehouse inventories, and collect forced municipal payments was vast. The Venetian Collegio del Sal operated a complex bureaucracy to track every ducat paid in transport subsidies against every ton delivered to storage. If a ship captain attempted to offload a portion of his cargo illegally at an intermediate port, or if warehouse guards colluded with local black market buyers, the state's profit margin eroded instantly. Despite these hidden operational costs and physical vulnerabilities, the medieval salt monopolies endured for centuries. They persisted because their underlying economic moat was virtually unassailable by traditional market forces. The first layer of this moat was geographical and infrastructural. Constructing a competitive solar salt production network was not simply a matter of digging shallow ponds along a coastline. It required access to specific coastal environments, tidal marshes with high ambient temperatures, low rainfall, sustained wind patterns, and impermeable clay soil. Furthermore, transforming hundreds of acres of marshland into engineered evaporation basins demanded immense upfront capital, specialized hydraulic engineering, and years of earth moving before the first harvest could occur. Potential competitors could not easily replicate this infrastructure, nor could they easily access the capital required to build it at scale. The second layer of the moat was state-sanctioned violence and regulatory capture. Venice did not rely solely on natural geographic advantages. It actively suppressed potential competition across its sphere of influence. Historical records show that when rival salt pans emerged along the Adriatic coastline, the Venetian navy was dispatched to physically destroy the dikes, flood the basins with fresh water, or force local rulers into treaties that mandated the immediate abandonment of production. In 13th century Crete, following a local rebellion, Venetian authorities explicitly ordered the destruction of island salt pans to ensure the local population remained entirely dependent on imported, state-controlled salt. By systematically eliminating alternative production nodes, Venice transformed the Adriatic Sea into a closed commercial ecosystem. Landlocked cities lacked the naval power to clear alternative trade corridors and the capital to construct rival infrastructure. They faced a market with a single, highly organized supplier. Acceptance of Venetian price floors and delivery quotas was not a market transaction. It was a condition of political and physical survival. To understand the financial magnitude of these operations, one must look past administrative statutes and reconstruct the underlying unit economics of the trade. While precise medieval financial records vary across decades, archival evidence from 14th century Venice provides a clear picture of the state's profit margins. Consider an illustrative economic model based on historical Venetian accounting records, evaluated on a per-ton basis in gold ducats. At the extraction site in a Pisa or a Puglia, raw solar salt was extremely cheap to produce. Venice's monopsony buying power allowed the state to acquire raw salt from local pan operators for approximately 1.5 to 2.0 ducats per ton. To move this salt to the lagoon, the Collegio del Sal paid private Venetian shipowners a subsidized freight rate of roughly 1.5 to 3.0 ducats per ton. Factoring in basic handling, offloading, and warehouse storage costs in Venice, the total accumulated cost to the state stood at approximately 3.0 to 5.0 ducats per ton. When this same salt was resold to captive inland buyers in northern Italy, the state set the wholesale monopoly price at 12.0 to 18.0 ducats per ton. This generated a gross operating margin of 60% to 75% on the state's wholesale distribution network. Under normal economic conditions, this high-margin structure generated extraordinary liquid cash flows. In the late 14th century, net annual profits from the Venetian salt monopoly routinely reached between 150,000 and 200,000 ducats. To put this number in perspective, it was sufficient to cover a major portion of the Republic's peacetime administrative expenditure, fund the construction of war galleys at the arsenal, and provide the liquid collateral necessary for the state to borrow money from private merchant banks at remarkably low interest rates. During peak commercial periods, when Mediterranean trade routes were open and inland agricultural yields were high, the salt monopoly functioned as a perpetual wealth engine. The state leveraged future salt tax revenues, much like a modern government issues sovereign bonds, using expected commodity margins to back public debt and finance military expansion. However, during crisis periods, such as a major naval conflict or prolonged regional rainstorms, the financial model inverted rapidly. Fixed infrastructure costs, guard payrolls, and diplomatic subsidies remained high, while physical supply volumes plummeted. In these moments, the state was forced to burn through its cash reserves or raise taxes elsewhere to maintain the physical security of its supply corridors. Yet, as soon as peace returned and the weather cleared, the inelastic nature of demand ensured that profit margins recovered almost immediately. For nearly 5 centuries, the medieval salt monopolies appeared indestructible. They were anchored in basic human biology, protected by naval dominance, and enforced by sovereign law. Yet, like all economic monopolies, they were ultimately dismantled not by moral outrage or political reform, but by technological substitution and the emergence of new production methods. The first major blow to coastal solar monopolies came from deep underground. During the 17th and 18th centuries, advances in mining technology and geological surveying enabled the large-scale exploitation of massive inland rock salt deposits, such as those in Cheshire, England, and Wieliczka, Poland. Unlike coastal solar pans, deep rock salt mines could operate continuously throughout the year, unaffected by rainfall, cloud cover, or ocean tides. Furthermore, the expansion of inland canal networks and improved road transport allowed mining operators to ship heavy bulk salt directly to inland urban centers, without passing through maritime ports or state-controlled coastal warehouses. The sudden influx of cheap, abundant inland rock salt shattered the spatial monopolies that maritime republics had defended for centuries. Maritime states could no longer enforce monopsony pricing, when inland buyers could source alternative supplies from overland river networks. The final institutional collapse of the system occurred during the political cataclysms of the late 18th century. In France, the Gabelle had become the ultimate symbol of royal extortion and economic inefficiency. The extreme price disparities, the violence of the customs guards, and the corruption of the private tax farmers generated overwhelming popular hatred. When King Louis XVI convened the Estates General in 1789, the formal lists of grievances submitted by representatives across the country overwhelmingly demanded the immediate abolition of the salt tax. In 1790, the French National Assembly formally dismantled the Gabelle, disbanded the army of 20,000 customs guards, and executed prominent tax farmers, including the renowned chemist Antoine Lavoisier. Overnight, artificial price barriers dissolved, and salt returned to its competitive market value. In the 19th century, the final economic link between salt and urban food security was permanently severed by the invention of mechanical refrigeration. Once electricity and artificial ice production allowed food to be preserved without chemical additives, salt was demoted from its status as a critical infrastructure utility to a simple low-cost industrial chemical and culinary seasoning. The history of medieval salt monopolies reveals a fundamental truth about economic systems. Whenever a society relies on an irreplaceable, non-substitutable resource for its basic survival or commerce, whoever controls the physical or legal bottlenecks of that resource will inevitably capture extraordinary economic rents. Venice did not achieve its wealth merely through brave merchants or clever diplomacy. It achieved wealth because it understood the mechanics of midstream infrastructure. It let others bear the weather risks of raw production, while it built a fortress around the shipping lanes, warehouses, and distribution points through which that production was forced to flow. The French crown did not view tax collection as a public service. It viewed it as a financial instrument to be securitized and leased to private capital, using sovereign violence to enforce an artificial market floor. While the physical commodity has changed, the underlying economic logic remains entirely intact today. Modern economies no longer wage wars over coastal salt pans or enforce compulsory purchase quotas on sodium chloride, but they operate under the exact same infrastructure dynamics. Today, midstream natural gas pipelines and liquid natural gas terminals control energy security in precisely the same way Venetian warehouses controlled food security. Cloud computing platforms and undersea fiber optic cables hold high-margin bottlenecks over global information flows, charging access tariffs to captive corporate users who cannot easily build alternative networks. High-tech manufacturing industries rely on tightly concentrated, state-subsidized supply chains for essential rare earth elements and semiconductor components. In every era, the name of the asset changes, but the system remains identical. The ultimate source of market power is rarely the raw commodity itself. It is the control of the bottleneck through which that commodity must pass. When an essential utility becomes the foundation of human survival or global commerce, can a truly free market ever exist? Or will whoever controls the bottleneck always end up owning the system?